Hey everyone, welcome to the SIG Network Policy API Upstream Community Meeting. Today is the 22nd of October, 2024. Let's all follow the CNCF Code of Conduct and be nice and kind with each other. We have a bunch of things on our agenda today, and we have also a quorum, so we can get started. Dhanush, is this your first time here, or
Yeah, this is the first time.
do you want to introduce yourself? And welcome.
Yeah, real quick. My name is Dhanush and I work at Optum as a data engineer. I was recently exploring these things. Yeah, excited. Looking forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Nadia, you have the first item here on the agenda. And meanwhile, if anybody has other stuff, please continue to add them here. But over to you, Nadia.
Yeah, that's a quick one. I tried to fix CI during this time, and that's when I figured that Dan is like the only active, let's say, contributor that can approve PRs, which makes it slightly difficult for us. So I was thinking maybe we should update this file.
Yeah,
I approve.
but who are you going to put there?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
We,
I mean,
don't,
it's. Okay,
so I was
ahead.
just going to say, we don't want it to be just Red Hat people.
You can add me. I mean, you know that I always ready to help. I mean, and you have other candidates.
Yeah, not really. I think myself and Surya kind of replaced Andrew at this point, so we can put also one of us there, and then Antonio is a great candidate.
And
I can put a PR up if
and we can leave Yang there and hope that he comes back to us.
Yes, not like we don't hope Andrew will come back.
He's working on Wall Street now. I'm dubious.
One day he will get nostalgic.
Yeah, the last time I spoke to him, he said he is willing to spend a few hours in the weekends, but so let's leave him there for now and then wait to see if he's able to spend some time. But I think +1 to Antonio being added, and maybe Nadia, you can do a PR.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, well, the next one is also from me. I wanted to get back to our discussion. I think there is another item here also about that, to moving to beta API. We had our project there actually kind of listing what we want to do. I'm not sure if some of the issues were not even closed, being stale from that list. So the idea is, I think we should get back to this discussion, update the list of things that still make sense and we find important to move to beta. And, well, basically try to work in that direction.
Yeah, I think Antonio, you have...
Yeah, beside the list, I really wanted to understand, because what triggered me was one change in one field that was breaking. So are we happy with the current API? Are the vendors implementing it happy with the current API? Do we have a minimum set of features that we are happy that we say, okay, this is gold, this is working, we are happy with this, let's move forward with this? I apologize because I was not following closely the project, so there maybe this question is redundant.
Nadia.
Yeah, so I think we have not changed the API for quite some time, but on the last meeting, Sean brought up some nice points. So I think we should try to address them, or at least make sure we have a decision for our beta API if we want to change some of these things or not. As Antonio said, I have just fixed like this empty port list last week. so that would be, I guess, that a list of things from the previous meeting basically would be the main point of potential change, and then everything else is fairly stable for quite some time now.
Yeah, I think we've had, so that is not the only breaking API change we've done. In the past, I've done a few bug fixes as I was implementing ANP on OV and Kubernetes, where we have done a few of such things where we snuck things in, but it's been pretty stable for the past few months. The only stuff that I know that we discussed in previous Chicago KubeCon was firstly all the implementations, and I think we have really good set of implementations. We have KubeOVN, OVN Kubernetes, Antria have finished implementing the core bits of the API. We have Calico who's finished implementing ANP and are implementing BANP right now. And I know Cilium is evaluating still how they want to implement things. So we are getting some good feedback. We just wanted to wait to see if Calico and Cilium also are happy with this. But I don't know if you want to wait till Cilium finishes implementation. But at least that was one point we had. And then for the API status, my major concern was tenancy, because the original had tenancy as a use case. And I know in Chicago KubeCon, FQDN and tenancy were the two things that we wanted to track. But then on the project dashboard, I don't know why tenancy is under. It's not.
No,
anyway.
before there is too much context, let me first one dumb question is, we talk about admin network policy only, right? Base admin network policy is just a different track, or are you putting all both things together?
It's the same, so it's together. So whoever implements ANP has to implement BANP as well. That's
The admin network policy API currently has two different objects, one of which is also called admin network policy and one of which isn't.
Oh, that's the part I was confused. Okay, so admin network policy include both APIs.
yeah.
And what is the tenancy thing?
Nadia, do you want to elaborate more on that
Yeah.
since you've been driving it?
Uh,
Yeah, maybe a high level
Yeah, so
context.
tenancy was a part of admin network policy originally that we then found was confusing and not well thought. So first we tried to update it and make more sense. But then what we ended up doing for now is we completely removed it from admin network policy. And now it's just an enhancement proposal state to like bring it back at some point as a new feature, basically.
Yeah, so my question is, are we not happy enough with the core and leaving FQDN and these other things as evolutions, like we do with the core types, that we then extend the existing API? I mean, why
No,
it's
PR
not
with-
complex to tie all these things together in an alpha API?
Yeah,
Yes, so now we
it's-
can do that because we removed the tenancy. So it's not there anymore. Nothing to worry about. FQDN, we can just discuss if we want to add that or not.
yeah, I think we can wait for FQDN also as a follow-up enhancement, right? Like a new feature that adds on the top. And for tenancy, the reason why I was concerned is we've removed it, right? But it was part of the original KEP, right? So we should go and remove it from the original KEP so that people don't get confused. So that's the difference between FQDN and tenancy in my case, because FQDN was never a part of the ANP Kubernetes enhancement proposal. So I don't know if there's rules around this, Dan.
I mean, you are the group. I mean, you did the exercise, you explained. I don't think why anybody has to argue, right?
Yeah.
So there's no rule that we have to implement exactly what we agreed
Yeah.
to in the CAP. What I was going to say, my point of view, I agree that the FQDN we could just put off to 1.1 or whatever, and because it's a pretty isolated, distinct whatever feature that will just fit on top of everything else. Tenancy, I'm afraid that we could end up deciding that the best way to implement tenancy is to slightly change how we're doing something else, and then we would be painted into a corner if we had already declared the rest of the API to be beta.
Okay. Well, but that's good to know then. if you identify tenancy as a core thing, I mean, at least we know.
I thought
Mm,
the
one-
FQDN stuff was in already. Is it not in? Has it not baked long enough to be considered beta? Is that the issue?
Yeah, it's not been baked enough and it doesn't have any implementation yet.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that's the key. We came up with an API we're happy with, but we don't have implementations of it yet, so we might still discover that it sucks.
Makes sense.
That's something we have experience with. That's with FQDN. Oh, cool. So this is really good.
So for tenancy, what are we saying? Do we think it's a core piece we need to wait on, or?
Look, if Dan says that it can jeopardy, I mean, if we want to evolve an API, then doesn't fit another feature that this group consider important. I mean, that's something to evaluate.
Can we sort of just look at the possibilities? It seems like either we bring back the same, not same labels into the admin network policy, or we have a completely separate resource, which is the current proposal. If we have a completely separate resource, it seems like there's nothing blocking the ANP from going to beta. But what about the other case? Would adding that same, not same selector stuff in a future beta, would that blow up? There might be other possibilities, of course, but I just thought we could look at the two likely scenarios.
We can add same, not same labels back in the future. I was worried more that we might want a larger change. Like, I forget if it was Nadia or Surya. I was talking to one of you and you were talking about oh no, it was Surya, because we were talking about baseline admin network policy and how that's going to interact with the multi-network stuff that we're doing in OpenShift. And that's kind of similar to tenancy. And there's this whole thing like, I worry that we will decide that baseline admin network policy is part of a particular design of how tenancy was going to work. And that if we change how tenancy works, then baseline admin network policy is no longer the right API either.
And if you follow that rationally, if we move admin network policy, the object alone.
Sorry, what was that?
So what I'm saying is, what I'm understanding is the problem that you see in the evolution if we move admin network policy as a whole, with admin network policy object and base admin.
They're a
baseline
single
network.
API that has two objects. Like we can't move one forward and not move the other. It's like saying that, we'll move endpoint slice forward but not service. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like they're part of the same API.
But that's the part that I need to revisit the API. I thought
There's a single concept of admin network policy which gets expressed via two different object types, right?
Okay.
But part of that original concept was also tenancy that worked in a particular way. And, in the tenancy discussions, we keep talking about people who have these ideas like, I want to block everything between tenants, or I want to block everything but only allow stuff between tenants. And that inherently interacts with what is currently baseline admin network.
Yeah. Now I understand.
And so
right.
I worry that if we will eventually come up with, okay, yes, now we understand this is how tenancy is going to work. And in that new understanding, there won't really be a good role for baseline admin tenants, baseline admin network policy anymore. And so I am reluctant to move to beta until we know what we're doing with tenancy. And it's possible that other people disagree with that. And I can be convinced otherwise. But that's what I'm thinking, that we should not go to beta until we know how tenancy is going to work.
This might be a very basic question, but I'm just looking around. Is tenancy covered in the KEP, or we removed it? I'm trying to get more information on.
The idea is in the KEP. The specific API proposed in the KEP was originally part of admin network policy, and then we removed it because as people started implementing it, it turned out to be really weird.
I see. Is there? I'm looking at the network policy pages and I don't see tenancy. So is it been backed out in some ways? Like,
Yeah. The original kept in Kubernetes repo, Kubernetes enhancements repo had it, but then we removed all references to it from our documentation, and that's why you won't find anything there. But there is an NPEP. And I know Nadia, you have your hand raised. So I'll give it over to you in a moment. But to learn more on our current proposal of tenancy and all the use cases that we are gathering, I'm going to put this on the chat.
okay, I will take a look at that. Thank you.
Yeah, let me link it here. Nadia, you seem to have your hand raised for some time.
Yeah, one more thing I wanted to ask before moving to beta potentially is, do we want to reconsider baseline ad network policy being a singleton? Because I mean, the only reason, as far as I remember, for doing that is we just couldn't find more use cases to add priority to that thing, but it doesn't mean there are none. And then also doing that, if also I remember correctly, could solve some of the tenancy design problems, because BNP not having a priority was one of them.
So this is exactly what I was talking about, that like our decisions on tenancy might change what we want for BANP.
Yeah,
But I don't think we should just proactively add priorities to BANP, because we still don't have any user stories that are part of the sort of accepted set of user stories that require multiple BANP.
right. What I'm saying is, I'm not sure if our accepted set of user stories is the best representation of what actually can be ever needed. So if we could get some feedback.
But
on
in that case, we don't want to go to beta with a bad set of user stories, right?
Yeah, that's what kind I'm saying.
Yeah, the goal definitely is not going to go to beta no matter what. It's going to beta with, you know, the thing that we are sure that is better. My question and why I'm bringing this beta thing is because if it keeps alpha, it push people out of adoption, right? And I wanted to help the project to move because we had a lot of good feedback in the last QCons. I don't want to see this effort to go stale. But yeah, the goal is not go to beta no matter what. It's to go beta with an API that we're happy with and that people implement it.
So there is another possibility here, which is that we could go to beta 1 with what we have. We can say, this is a useful set of functionality. People are using it. You can do good things with it. It doesn't do everything we want, but you can use it. And then we just reserve the right to follow it up with an incompatible beta 2.
The thing is, you know how Ingress ended in beta during, I don't know, 5-6 years? This is going to be the same. What I'm trying to say, if you depends how much incompatible you mean, right? If it's incompatible as I can give you an upgrade path, I think that works. If it's incompatible, we're going to change fields and everything that you have in your cluster is not going to work.
The way that I would think would make sense is that we would make sure that it was easy for implementers to support both the V1 Beta 1 and V1 Beta 2 APIs with the same implementation.
Yeah, so they have an upgrade path. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, if they have an upgrade path, that's on the API design policy, right? You can break meanwhile you allow people to.
Right, but I mean, you know, the idea we would want to not totally, you know, make everything insanely different between V1 Beta 1 and V1 Beta 2. Like,
yeah, of course. That's why I asked is, are you happy with some core functionalities that you say and all the vendors say, I'm completely sure I'm not going to change it, right? If you have these fields, it makes sense to go to beta, right? And the things that you have more doubts, I don't know, we can find
I think if we
Yeah.
went to beta now, it would not be the worst API in Kubernetes. Like, it is possible that if we spent another year, we could come up with a more awesome version of admin network policy beta 1, but you know, we wouldn't regret it if we did it now. I don't think.
Well, I think that's the exercise, right, of this group. You the people working on this. So what I'm saying, it just say that it's a matter of spending more time and more people. I think that there's people willing to help.
But we want feedback, and it's possible that, you know, putting out a beta API would get us a lot more feedback than we're getting now.
That's my point. That's what I try to say. The alpha thing blocks people of giving feedback. That's a fact.
Yeah, I think I agree with the fact that it could kill momentum if we stay on alpha, and we could get more feedback with beta. But at the same time, I know that tenancy is one of the asks that's already coming as a result of feedback. I know at least 2 people on OpenShift who asked the same thing, that how can they express tenancy, right? So I know it's going to come as an ask. Yeah, I don't know if other implementations have feedback coming in.
Tenancy is generally something that comes up from our users from time to time as well. They just ask for it, not in relation to does admin network policy support it, because we don't have that out there yet, but just it is an ask that we get from time to time. It's definitely a use case that's out there.
Okay, so we know that we have tenancy as an important thing that we really were not able to get a good grasp on it, but we know that it's going to interact with APIs. So then it seems that if we want to move to beta, we need to consider how tenancy can impact, and yeah. So the only thing that you foresee that tenancy is going to impact is base admin policy than another?
Of the stuff that we're currently considering, tenancy is the one that I think has the most possibility of requiring major changes to get it the way we want. Yeah.
Okay, so what then since an area that we need to work, I will try to read more with Bowie and others. Besides that, are we happy with putting FQDN aside as a follow-up feature?
Yeah.
So we only need to concentrate on the tenancy problem?
Yeah, FQDN doesn't even have to be a new version of the API, right? Because it's purely additive.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
If you can add fields to APIs, okay, cool. And the people from Calicos and Sirius and others are happy with this? I don't know if Sirius
Sure.
people too here.
Okay.
Okay.
Nathan from Cilium's here. I don't know how far you guys are with Cilium implementation, Nathan.
For ANP
Yeah.
or FQDN?
No, ANP, FQDN will it?
We are not far with ANP. It was something we wanted to do at the beginning of the year, and nobody, I think I don't remember what the use case was around that, but I think that whatever it was, it's been deprioritized. So there's no one currently working on ANP on Cilium.
But this doesn't, what I want to, because the experience we had is this API is feasible, right? It's not like with the drama with the port, dynamic ports or port ranges or something like that.
As far as we understand the API, we don't have any issues with it.
Okay, that's good. I'm just taking precautions because we have this bad experience. But thank you. I don't have more questions.
I think on the Calico side, we're reasonably happy with it. Our implementation went reasonably smoothly. There are a couple of those little details that we came across during implementation where I think we're just going to hopefully add a restriction on one of the fields so that the ambiguous value can't be there, and like maybe that's something we can put in. But I think we're reasonably happy with how it fits onto our stuff. Tenancies are the interesting thing, but having multiple baseline admin network policies wouldn't really affect our implementation. That would be okay for us. So if that was the outcome of that, it wouldn't, that particular problem wouldn't trouble us too much in a sort of second beta. I can't think of anything else.
To just talk about Cilium for a second. The Cilium policy engine, this just in the last several months underwent the largest amount of change it's gone through in like the past 3 years. We ripped out the core data structure that was driving it and replaced it with something else. So it's a very different beast than it was even 3 months ago. So if there's anyone, I would hesitate to encourage anyone who's interested in it now, because there's still a few more things that we have planned for it. But it's going to be in a much more, the user space code in particular is a lot easier to understand now than it was. So I don't know if anyone's gone into Cilium Policy Engine before and been daunted by it. I think it's a lot simpler now. So if anybody is interested on doing the Cilium ANP implementation, I would suggest that in the next month or so would be a good time to attempt it. So there's
Nathan,
me
this
showing
is
for
I'm speaking as someone who's been trying to straddle both worlds. Is this worth discussing in the Cilium SIG policy?
Absolutely. There's an open Cilium SIG policy meeting the second Tuesday of every month. If folks are interested, please show up and feel free to push on the ANP. I don't think right now, I don't think any of the core committers are terribly motivated to work on it. But I would be more than willing to help someone through dealing with it.
Okay, that's good to know. I
Thank
have
you.
a question. Sorry, Nadia, you have a hand. I don't want to.
Yeah, just while we are at this topic, we've actually started. I've resurrected the tenancy NPAP recently based on Sean's feedback. So there is a link already to this NPAP. Just please go take a look. It's ready for another review, I would say.
Yeah, I've linked it here on the agenda. So please do leave some reviews. Thank you, Nadia. Boe, you were saying?
I'd say this, and please, I'm starting to get back ramped into this project. I'm curious if, as part of this API design, we've evaluated how this works under massive scale. Because I know, like, this is something where an interesting place where sometimes the API interactions are pretty subtle. So I leave that as like a very generic comment. But that's one axis, I think, while it's in alpha and beta, it's kind of, people are more focused on semantics and less focused on like, if this has to scale up to, let's say, like a 20,000 node cluster or something. So that's something I'm happy to kind of scan through to understand. I think Antonio.
Yeah, this is because I created these Q network policies and all this stuff, because we are developing features and we are not getting feedback, and then later we found all these bottlenecks. I mean, there are things that we need implementations, and we had feedback like 5 minutes ago from Calico about something like that. So we can spend hours with the design of the APIs, but until we don't implement and we run, I don't know, some prototypes or with customers or with something, we are not going to find out. So that's why I'm asking that all the vendors are on board and everybody's implementing. We need to get this into the user's hands. And yes, we are testing all these admin network policies and queue network policies in the scale, but with my implementation. It runs all the scalability tests and all the stuff. But you have a lot of, the problem is with network policies, you have a lot of dependencies on the implementation. So it depends on the technology that you use. And each technology is going to have their own problems. So that's why we need people implementing it. So I remember the Ethereum had the problem with the map, right? That they don't have the thing that they can do variable matching on for the port ranges
So-
and all the things, right? Or something like that. Nothing.
I think that's been
Give me
fixed,
honest.
Antonio, actually. So
Yeah, that's what I was referring to with all of the churn in the Cilium policy engine, and we ripped out the core data structure. So we've migrated from a map to now we have a user space longest prefix match data structure that we're using. And that's been why there's been so much change, and there's been a lot of like under the hood changes in the Cilium policy engine that haven't necessarily resulted in any direct features, but have vastly improved performance, and then also set us up to be able to address ANP and some of the other features that we see coming from this group, and then obviously, you know, the private stakeholders that
Yeah, I
the
didn't mean
various
to
committers work for.
I didn't mean to nitpick on that. It was an example that we can develop the API that we want until we don't implement it, we are not going to know, right? And because reasons or whatever, it's just I just wanted to highlight. Maybe I shouldn't pick on that example. Sorry.
I think that's fair. What I would say is that policy in general, like has precedence, is a precedent scaling problem without even explicitly identifying precedence. So
Yeah.
I think it's so one of the questions I had with scale is it's tricky because, like you said, right, like one set of it is on the implementation. So what Cilium has a scale consideration might not be a thing for Calico, and vice versa for other implementations. But from API perspective, when we say scale aspects, it's things that all implementations are facing equally, right? Like, so things like, because on general, I would expect people to create less admin network policies compared to network policies, which is on every namespace for every workload. And I would imagine people to be using ANP in a more cluster-wide way. But I think the problem comes in with regards to the pod selectors, where we have like, I don't know, like what Pove said, 20,000 nodes with 100K
yeah, I
pods
think
or
it's like a
something.
bit subtle, and unfortunately, this is sort of like a area that doesn't have a lot of historical like sort of documentation on how to reason about this. I'll give you an example. So on the pod spec, there is this port remapping thing between the container port and the external port. And the subtle outcome of that is that every local agent needs to watch this thing and kind of deal with it. And you can't do this like it's kind of in a centralized place. So that data dependency in the schema basically has like resulted in a necessity to like have a local agent do a port remapping. I don't know if people are following my example, but I'm just saying like those subtle things result in kind of like you have to do it one way basically. And we just need to be sure that it's not that one way is not like going to end up in a scale issue. I say this not having a really detailed look at admin network policy, but I'm saying like we just it's part of the API design thinking, I guess, apart from the semantics itself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think one of the other examples for ANP we know we had was with named ports, where we had a dependency on the pod container ports, where we have to go and check them and then form rules, but maybe what you said is similar to that in some sense. But I don't think we have, as a group here, discussed scale in depth or evaluated much. So maybe that is something that we should start doing.
I do think we've touched on it a little bit, Surya. Like we've talked about named ports, and I don't think named ports have gone in the AMP. And we touched on like same, not same labels, which is another case where things could blow up. And before it was removed, I know you'd made the decision to move it to namespaces only to sort of limit that impact as well. So I do think we have people on the committee who are thinking in those ways and have been burned by, for example, named ports.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
so
we've
I think
discussed
one
it.
thing would really help is let's make sure that discussion is captured in the KEP in some section, because I think that's really good. It's discussed and it's almost like prophylactic to like adding to the API. Like, oh, okay, like we already know this kind of trade-off is needed.
Yeah, I can maybe just start with documentation for scale considerations, and then we can add on that. So I'll just start a PR with everything we know we've discussed here, and then also think about things we haven't discussed. And if we need to do any scale numbers, we can try to get some done.
This is kind of random. Who is going to be at KubeCon in Salt Lake City? I'm happy to like do an informal meetup to kind of discuss stuff.
I know I'll be there. Yeah, I know I'll be there. Dan will be there. Nadia will be there. Sean will be there. Could do an informal meetup. We haven't really planned anything official, but
Or just send to the Signature mailing list and organize that. I mean,
okay, I mean, I can kick off the email. That's easy to do. And then we can kind of have a hallway conversation. I would love to see everyone in person, so it makes it easier than over Zoom.
We could also have tenancy v2 discussion. I think we managed to remove it actually after one of the KubeCons, so maybe we can get it back in another one.
yeah, thanks, Chloe, for bringing that up. So maybe we can have something informal. And yes, Nadia, we can try to also at least settle on the use cases again, if that's what we're doing now with tenancy. But yeah, cool. I think that was a great discussion. We have a few points forward. I think maybe let's wait till KubeCon to have a little bit more discussions on tenancy, but definitely keep Antonio's point in mind with regards to thinking about beta. I'll try to clean up the project tracker board. I think the only other aspect outside of the API scale and implementations is the tests, which I know we have some conformance tests, but there is still parts of the core which we are not testing. And there is a few issues that are, let's say, going stale and rotten because of lack of contributors. So if anybody wants to help us with writing tests, please reach out to me or look at the link here. We tag our tests with area/conformance, and you can see most of them are lifecycle rotten. So maybe that's where we need to start. I'll just put them here on the agenda. The other item I wanted to actually talk about was exactly that. So issue triage, cleanup project health. I think traditionally in this meeting, we have not done that. We usually just do it ad hoc when people bring up things. And because of this, the project goes a little bit stale. Like sometimes I occasionally go and say, not right, life cycle rotten, but it's also hard to find contributors that way when some of the issues have gone stale. I was thinking maybe we can spend a few minutes at the beginning of the network policy meeting, just like in SIG network, to go through issues. Maybe we can just do 3 issues or 4 issues in a meeting, the first 10, 15 minutes, if people are okay with it. I see a thumbs up from Nadia. And okay, I think there's no objections to that. We can try to do that. The other item I had was, do we have any concerns with me moving the node egress peer and networks egress peer to the standard channel now that we have implementations implementing it? And are we okay with me doing that, or are there any concerns?
What is this thing of the channels that I saw a comment from Dan Wiship in the Gateway project?
So I think the naming, the way this works for us is slightly different from how Gateway API does it. For us in our project, we just have experimental and standard. When we add a new feature, we put it in the experimental till we get new implementations. And once we get feedback and it has had enough soak time, like 6 months or 1 year, we move it to standard. But when we do the release, we ship it as 2 different channels, let's say. And standard is like the core ones, which we try not to have breaking API changes on, but since we are still in alpha, it can happen.
So there had been some discussion, I forget what the other axis is, of like optional features. And that was the thing that Antonio, that I was saying projects should not be doing.
Yeah, that's the part
Extension,
that
extended.
that's I really find that weird.
Yeah.
Oh.
Like
So the thing here is just about like stability level of the API proposal, not about requiredness.
Okay.
Yeah, for example, FQDN would stay in experimental because, it's a new API. We have not gotten any implementations. If we want to move to like it till we get the implementation, it's just a way of signaling what is stable and what is not right now from what we discussed previously.
But then you have 2 dimensions, the API version and the channel version.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a patch release thing that we do. We have 2 channel version and we have an API version. So we have like 3. Can't get more complicated than that. Nadia, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I wanted to ask how many implementations actually do that? Do we know?
Do you guys do it, Calico? Sean?
I think we've done networks. I think nodes didn't quite make the cut for our release. That's a little bit more tricky actually, because nodes have like several IP addresses and they may have IP addresses not known to Kubernetes and so on. So I wasn't sure if we had a good definition of what exactly it should match, but we didn't. I think it didn't make the cut, so we haven't looked at it in detail yet, and we didn't quite get to it.
So I think Calico does networks. I know Andrea did nodes, maybe not. I'm remembering this wrong. I have to check with Yang. Is he here today? No. I don't know what Kubovian did. I have to also ask them.
I think when we discussed FQDNs, it was discussed as optional or not and that kind of thing. So if we're changing to not have any optional things and everything's mandatory and experimental means something different than optional, then that feels like a change from the conversation that I remember having about it. I think FQDN support is in our enterprise product, and convincing folks to move things to open source adds a big spanner in the works of implementing things and turns things into business decisions instead of implementation decisions and all that sort of stuff. But I don't know how we want that to play out.
I mean, this is not a Kubernetes conformance issue. Like Cilium could decide that it would implement the full admin network policy API in its commercial product and only partially implement it in its open source product. And, you know, all that means is that you're only partially implementing the API in your open source product.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that might just be what we do. But I think exactly how we express that matters a little bit. There was talk of having a supported feature matrix like the Gateway API has, where some features are, supported by everybody, some features are supported by a family of implementations that all have some particular technology or not. But yeah, maybe we should discuss that further.
I don't think that Gateway API is a good example of. I mean, they are now requesting to put the APIs in core because they say that they don't have adoption. So I don't think that they are a good example of how to build this complexity of enterprise versus OSS versus whatever.
I think in the beginning, like Sean was mentioning, we did have this goal of taking this from Gateway API. That is the whole concept of standard and extended / core and experimental came from Gateway API, and all our docs also point to that. So we did discuss on doing the same way, right? Like having something be optional for people. But then I know that we discussed this in Chicago KubeCon again, and I think we all did. Like I remember Dan saying that it is not how we want to probably do this, but then we angled towards it being an optional versus mandatory.
Yeah, but besides that conversation, why don't we focus on the core things that we want, and we leave this discussion of optional enterprise features that people want, but they only want to enterprise or whatever. And I just trying to say that for me are two different conversations, right? It's how to integrate this complexity, and the other is what is the minimum thing that we all want.
Mm-hmm.
But in Gateway, and where we originally copied their vocabulary, Gateway has the concept of official, fully supported GA features, which not all implementations support. And so the question is whether we are going to have that same concept in admin network policy. And it sounds like maybe we did get rid of all of those and I just didn't notice. Or I got confused with the stability level vocabulary.
No, I mean,
I can give some context because I'm the one who came up with that. So the point, okay, so Gateway API, I think one of the challenges that it was trying to tackle was that there were a wide variety of actual implementations that were like so different that, for example, it's like an in-cluster proxy versus a managed proxy and versus mesh, that we knew that there were some common elements, and then there was some elements to which basically all these three branches that I just talked about, there might be even more branches, kind of like for sure diverged, but within each branch, there would be some sort of standardization. We didn't want to end up in a situation where we ended up with like the lowest common denominator period, which would basically just like cut off all the branches. At the same time, we didn't want a situation where those things couldn't standardize naturally. So the point is not so much a difference between enterprise features versus like non-enterprise features. It was more that to capture that ecosystem, we needed to allow each individual sub ecosystem to be able to standardize. Now, okay, so coming back to network policy, it's, as far as I can tell, it's not an existing landscape where we had these really divergent ecosystems and we're trying to kind of unify the commonalities. So my general take on it is it feels less urgent to have something like the extended. I hope this explanation is making sense.
It is certainly very interesting to hear your thoughts of that coming from the perspective of like early Gateway API, why it has extended. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'm also one of the people who actually took it. Me and Andrew both together actually took the concept from Gateway API, right? And I know our docs today also mention it, but maybe for now we go with changing this to meaning stability in Network Policy API, if that is what makes more sense for us, because we probably should do what makes more sense for our APIs.
Well, but no, Gateway has both of those concepts, and it sounds like we started with both of them as well, but now only have the experimental versus standard and not the core versus extended distinction, which is good, I think.
Yeah, at least, well, we need to change a few bits of our code to reflect that, but for most parts, you're right. We still have some tests where I call it core, I think, which I should change.
Yeah, and I think the optional I forget what the name of the channels are, but like that one was basically as a result of this lots of experience with alpha beta and GA not quite working out for versioning. So I think like Rob Scott, it's the main presentation, like you can check out details on kind of that experience.
I think from a practical point of view, like we've gotten the calls and helped standardize the API so it works for us, but we may not implement it, so we become a partial implementation in the open source version. It's kind of the only field that has that problem for us, I think. So it's I feel like it's something we can figure out at a documentation like level and that kind of thing if need be. So
Which
I don't
field?
think we need
Which
whole
field
separate.
was it, Sean?
Sean,
It's just the FQDN field is a
Okay.
little bit contentious for us, just because FQDN support ended up in our enterprise product way back when. So we worked to validate that the design of it worked for us, and we're happy with that that we can put that in our enterprise version of ANP. But the decisions around what goes in enterprise and open source kind of get it gets difficult. There's business
Yeah, well-
interests and everything get involved, so it's difficult for me to commit to a full implementation in open source that has FQDNs in it.
But this is the only contentious point. And we are saying that FQDN is still not in the table for beta.
Yeah, it's marked as experimental, so we can push off the decision about whether we have optional things or not. Since it's in the experimental thing. But I did feel like that discussion had been had and we had optional things, and then it seems like things have changed at a meeting that I wasn't at.
Yeah, there had previously been other features which had been discussed as potentially optional or that some implementations may have had trouble with. It's really interesting to hear from Nathan saying that like there's no objections to the API currently from Cilium side, which is encouraging because I think like an audit or like unenforced dry run mode was one of those that it sounds like there is no longer interest in having that part of the core or having that part of the API at all. There was I can drop a link to the issue in that. And like priority levels, I think is something else that is currently part of core and was previously something that I think Cilium had thoughts that it may be difficult to implement for them. So if the landscape has changed, that it would be great to know. I just wanted to kind of raise and make sure that there is alignment on all of these potential things on the cusp there.
To echo Sean's sentiment, I think what you'll find on the Cilium side is a willingness to help open source contributors. But in terms of Isovalent employees who are core committers to the Cilium project, I don't think you're going to see a lot of active engagement on implementing core Kubernetes, or not core Kubernetes, but new API fields or features, unless there's a significant business interest to do so.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that we should focus on the API with the core features that everybody wants, right? If we want to build the perfect API, we end in this conundrum of business versus implementation versus employee versus open source that we are not going to solve.
So not an enterprise version, in the OSS version, whoever's taking notes. I think
Yeah,
we're in a
OSS.
similar situation to Calico where
yeah, that's what I'm
you know, if
saying.
it's
So my point is, if FQDN is a friction because whatever is too late, or everybody implemented in the enterprise or whatever, why are we trying to put in a public API?
I think Calico's the odd one out here for FQDN being an enterprise. I think everyone else is planning to put
Yeah.
it, or already has it, or is planning to put it in their open source.
Okay,
If they
so
don't have.
I understood it all. Okay.
So
Anyway.
Yeah.
from my point of view, like I can't really push back on it being in the standard, and it's happy. We're kind of happy if it's something that we can just implement in enterprise. That's a very easy sell on my side, that it's in the API, and when we have our enterprise version installed, you get that feature. It's a much harder sell to open source that feature, and requires a lot more discussion, and may or may not happen depending on if there's agreement there. So when it was presented as something that we could make optional in the API, and we'd have a kind of, we'd have features that we could just mark as optional while still being conformant with the rest, then that was a very happy place for me to be, because it just deferred all of these decisions. If we're saying that we don't really have any other optional things, and then Calico's just going to present as we're a partial implementation, we don't support this one feature unless you get the enterprise version. That's also probably livable with, because there's only just one thing that we have to document around like that. So it's probably not a massive deal.
Okay, then I'm confused. So you already have a solution that works for all of you.
Yeah, I'm just saying, when I thought that we had this concept of this is an optional API, and it would be natural for people to document, oh, these are the optional things that we support, like you do for Gateway API, then that was a happy place for me to be, because it meant there was no issue. I could just say it was not supported, and it didn't mean we weren't conformant, if you see what I mean. Whereas
this doesn't change, right? This is a discussion, right?
Right, so that's, I think, even, so if I'm understanding this correctly from what everybody is saying, it's not like we have decided one or the other, right? We haven't taken a stance yet. That's something that I wanted to clarify, because I know, Sean, you mentioned that, it seems like the decision was made somewhere, but I don't think we actually decided. We've always been doing this back and forth, where we're always confused on whether we should make the optional versus mandatory a thing or not. And we're having this over and over, is my understanding.
yeah, okay.
Nadia?
Yeah, I think Dan at least did say a couple times before that we didn't want to have the optional field, but actually only experimental, meaning we are still experimenting with the API. But the idea was to always get it to the standard channel. I think we even had it written down somewhere. So that was the idea. And yeah.
I have certainly said that before. I am, as Surya said, I'm not convinced that we ever formally adopted that.
Right. Exactly, because I remember us talking about it, and I know Dan mentioned it, which is what made us rethink this whole thing. But if I go look at the docs today, I'm pretty sure we have the core and extended in our terminologies, or even in the conformance test code, right? So I don't think we've written it down yet, unless I'm forgetting something.
Oh, very likely we didn't follow up on the decision. It's just, I think, the latest discussion I remember, so wanted to bring it up.
Anyway,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is something we need to resolve for beta.
This is
Yeah,
also really
I-
helpful context, so I'm glad that we're discussing this because I'm coming from a different background and perspective, and when I see some terms like optional, I'm often thinking of them in the Gateway API context.
Okay, that's a really good thing. So
Yeah, I
we-
think maybe then, should I just open an issue for this to make sure at least this discussion is captured somewhere this time? And if the consensus is to remove anything being optional, at least it's written down, right? Okay. I'll try to do an action item to write it down. And I think coming back to the original discussion for should we make nodes and networks a part of the core API before we go beta, I think Nadia has a good point on we have to figure out a list of implementations that have implemented it. I think I can try to reach out to Andrea and KibOVN to see what they have done. But I think OVN Kubernetes does nodes and networks. Calico does networks. That's 2 networks. We need a second implementation for nodes or something. So let's figure out who's done nodes. Okay, in lieu of time, I know we're 4 minutes over. If anybody needs to drop, please do. But the other major thing I wanted to quickly iterate over is we were trying to cut a 0.1.6 release. So we have this whole annotation when we use Kubernetes. Like when we are a part of the Kubernetes API, we have an annotation that we do, and that means that we need to get API reviews every time we push for changes. And we wanted to get into a meeting with Antonio and Tim and Dan and talk through these things. I know it's been stalled for some time, but I'm trying to, maybe I'll take this over from Andrew to see if we can see if all the current core changes in the API look good, in which case we can try to cut a patch release with everything latest, because we've also finished shipping FQDN. I'm not yet sure what's the best way to do that. I'll definitely reach out to Andrew to see if he still wants to do this or if somebody else needs to take over. And Hunter, you have an item. Are you on the call?
Yeah, hey everyone. So just wanted to briefly posit the idea of a policy assistant release. I know Surya and I at the last KubeCon, we were kind of suggesting people fork this code and run this make command and maybe modify some code to mess around with AMP, but it would be nice if people could just download the CLI and start using it. So just had a few PRs that might require some owner approvals if we were to do that. So yeah, I was hoping we could maybe cut a release before KubeCon. If you guys think that's doable.
I
Yeah,
don't have any.
so, Surya mentioned at the beginning that I'm apparently now the only approver or the only active approver for Network Policy API, and I had not really realized that. So I will try to do a run through open PRs.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Dan. I just made
Yeah.
this issue yesterday, so it's not like it's been going on for a while.
I don't mind doing a tag, right? Or a pre-tag plus a release for policy assistant, totally fine with that. I was about to say you probably do need to reach out to Dan because I also don't have the permissions to cut a release or do anything of that sort in the repo. So definitely reach out to him for help.
Okay.
I think it's a
And I
good
Well,
thought you
idea.
have to
I'm
do
like-
the same, Dan.
I think it's a good
Cool.
idea to get it built and get it out there so it's easier for people to play with.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, guys.
That's very good, yeah. Sean, you're up next.
Yeah, I started on the slides for KubeCon, so I think Nadia and myself are doing the readout from the group this time. We've got a very small slot in a bigger presentation, so I think we need to kind of cut it down to something like 4 slides, maybe 3 or 4 slides. My rough idea for that was got to have an intro slide saying who we are and why we're stood here. Probably 1 slide giving the kind of progress and kind of selling AMP, BAMP, because that's the thing that has had quite a lot of progress, I think. And a slide with implementation logos and stuff on that felt like it was a nice thing from last time. Is there anything else to cover? I think policy assistance probably the other thing that's had a lot of development. So should we try and squeeze in a slide for that, Hunter? And
Yeah, sure.
opinions welcome if you think this is the right sort of direction to go in. I think we've got very limited time, like because there's 5 groups presenting in a 35-minute slot, so I think we can have 1 or 2 slides on each thing.
Yeah, I think that sounds good to me, Sean, given the time constraints. And also, it's not like we've done a whole lot from the previous KubeCon, so I think keeping it short and just telling the highlights sounds good to me.
Sounds good. Carry on with that then.
All right, I think we are 9 minutes over. Any last minute things people want to bring up before we end the meeting? I think we had a great meeting and there's a lot of action items and consensus to go over. I'll slowly start doing that through issues of years. Going once, twice, and
We need
so cool.
to fix the CI, Surya. We'll take a look
Yes.
tomorrow. Bye.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Antonio, for that.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.